So the prompt for paper 2 is discuss the legacy and significance, or the significance and the legacy of the classical world. So what are the classics? So if you go to Harvard or Oxford, there are people who study the classics. Not so popular today, but certainly all throughout the last century, studying the classics. You study the output, the products, the story, the legacy of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We call Greece Hellas. That's what the Greeks call it. So it's the classics cover ancient Hellas and also Rome, meaning the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. So this is nothing new. And in truth, up to 30 years ago, people would mainly focus on Greece and Rome exclusively. And then we had this famous Middle Eastern historian whose quote sums it up perfectly. Petrarch said, all history is praise of Rome. All history is praise of Rome, said the Middle Ages historian Petrarch. He's basically saying, why bother? Why bother study any other point in history? Rome created this perfect society, a classic society. Why study anything else but the classics? All history is praise of Rome. And in fact, probably the most famous work of history from the 17th century onward is The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. So anyone who went to an upper class school would have studied the 30 or so volumes, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. And it's only in the last 30 years that people have started to challenge the study of the classics. People have said, well, maybe the classics aren't so significant. Maybe we're obscuring something. Maybe we shouldn't just praise Rome and praise Greece. And one of my favorites, and you can find the videos online, is Terry Jones has a series of documentaries called Barbarians. And he looks at who the Romans called barbarians. He said, wait a second. The Goths, the Celts, the Vandals, maybe they weren't so barbaric. Maybe the Romans were barbaric. And he starts to challenge the perspective that praised Rome and ignored other civilizations. And that's why this class and classes like it are no longer called Western civilization. Because that's what the purpose of those classes were, Western civilization. Let's look at what happened in Greece, how Greece gave its legacy to Rome, how Rome gave its legacy to Europe, how Europe gave its legacy to America, and there you go. That's all we need to study. But now we have more of a multicultural perspective, and we can challenge the legacy of the classical world. But nonetheless, as we're studying other civilizations, we should break down the classical world and see if there is significance there. Because maybe it's gone too far. Maybe in not praising Rome and not looking at the classics, we're leaving out a lot of legacy. So one way to break it down is quite simply, on a piece of paper, write out SPIRE, S-P-I-R-E. So we can break it down socially, S for social. We can break it down politically, P for politics. Break it down intellectually, I for intellectual segment of society. R for religion, and E for economics. So all of a sudden, with SPIRE, we've got 5 categories with which to break down the classical world. What was social life like in ancient Rome? What was social life like in ancient Greece? What was political life like? There was vibrant and diverse political life. What is the intellectual legacy? What did they do in terms of literary output, in terms of philosophical output? What did they leave behind that's intellectually challenging to us? What about their religion? They had deep and meaningful beliefs. What is their religion like? And let's not overlook economics. What was important economically? Who did they trade with? Were these wealthy societies? Was wealth important? And all of these things interact. So the economics obviously interacts with social life. Social life interacts with politics. So we can look in chapter 3 and chapter 4 of Persian Fire. We can see how some people in Athens and Sparta were getting wealthy, and there was a lot of social antagonism. And so they had to reform the government in those societies. They had to reform the politics in those societies. And they came up with different forms of government. So this is what's so impressive about ancient Hellas, ancient Greece, the diversity of the different city-states. The different city-states brought up different forms of government. Some were monarchies with a king, mono, one leader, a king. Some were tyrannies with a decisive leader who was considered tyrannical, who made all the decisions. Some were democracies, demos, the many, the people, ruled by the many, a democracy. And in Sparta, we had an oligarchy, just like in economics, an oligopoly, ruled by the few. And so we have all of these different ways of governing that were present in Greece. So it's no wonder that people study the classical world. And so if you look at the political life of the classical world, it's no wonder that our founding fathers studied the ancient world. If you look at the writings of founding fathers in the United States like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they carefully studied ancient Rome. They carefully studied the city-states of ancient Hellas. And they copied many features, which is why even today we still have a Senate. Rome had a Senate. The city-states in ancient Greece, the polis, they had assemblies in ancient Athens. And we can also look at the intellectual life of ancient Greece and Rome and what they left behind. The great philosophers. The great philosophers, it's easy to name Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, who discussed the great questions of life, the intellectual questions of life. So it's pretty obvious the foundation of all philosophy, all study of philosophy today, reaches back to Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and some of the great Roman philosophers as well, such as Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, the emperor philosopher. So we look at religion also, and we see that Greece and Rome shared the Pantheon of Gods. They had different names. So Neptune in Rome is Poseidon in Greece. Zeus in Greece is Jupiter in Rome, and so on. But the Pantheon is the same. They believed strongly in a diverse pantheon of gods, and they believed those gods were anthropomorphic and interfered in daily life. And their religion and their mythology was a very strong belief system. It wasn't just simple stories. It was a very strong belief system. So what can we learn from their religion today? Well, we can see that the Greeks believed strongly in tragedy. They believed strongly in hubris and nemesis and tragedy of life. And so that, again, loops back to their philosophy. So these are things worth studying. We can see by breaking it down in these categories, S-P-I-R-E, we can see that there is a legacy and significance to the classical world. We can look up Tom Holland and get some quotes where he talks about these concepts, and we can find other sources online also that reinforce these different concepts. And so in a paper we would discuss these and then wrap it up with a conclusion. What do you think? Do you think there's a significant legacy to the classical world? Should all history be praise of Rome?